Much of this will be a review of what I actually began in 2013 with the very first president's report. And I used this picture that shows my grandfather and my mother looking down on what would become, I guess, the battleground. In the far corner over there is where I ended up building, and we'll go over that issue in some detail. But at that time, I remarked on what I thought the future of the corporation should be. At that time, yeah, I recited something I'd actually written to Kathy and Gary back in 2007, and he was omitted from our emails at that time because he was persona non grata to everyone. So at that time, I was 17, 18 years ago, I said that I think that we are going to start to need to prepare this for some sort of transfer of stewardship of this land. And I thought that with an arrangement I described above, that mom and dad would find it appealing and we'd happy to be a part of, still able to generate significant amounts of income from a controlled development. It will mean finding the right partner. This arrangement should be appealing and profitable to the right group. We might also be able to reduce taxes enough so that we were able to monitor the transition. I look forward to their thoughts. The land that we have come into ownership of is the greatest asset that probably any of us will have in our lifetime. And that's the way I manage it going forward. And I thought that there were the basic objectives that we were going to need to deal with. We're going to need to clean the property up and need to manage the forest, prepare the property for partner and or sale, establish a conservation easement on a portion of the property which our mother vitally wanted. Finally, we're going to have to maintain property rights that had been established by ancestors and by our parents. We're going to have to clean up the property. I thought that was very straightforward. Because all you had to do is look around and see, as much as my parents loved the land, unfortunately, they were very neglectful of the land in some regards. That it was slowly being turned into a dump pit. And as soon as I came on board and had the capacity, I decided to begin cleaning it up and using an excavator here. You see me loading up these enormous dumpsters to clean up carp on the forest and such. So the idea of cleaning up the property was a difficult one because it meant encountering and handling these old buildings that my grandfather had established. This was the old camping barn. And as nostalgic as it was from the outside, you look to the inside, it was just full of trash everywhere. So this is how the land would look. That historical building gone, but it needed to be done. Enhance the value of the property. So one of the iconic things on the property, noted by everyone out on the lake, this old barn from this is a picture taken in the 1960s. And unfortunately, it too had been treated as a trash disposal site. Managed to get that cleaned up so that the place was somewhat presentable should anyone come and take a look at it. Fortunately, the stanchions were beginning to shift off of the frigs. So I put stay cables on with come-alongs to try and get them to not fall completely off of their pedestal. Unfortunately, July of 2014, we had a huge windstorm. That windstorm fell this enormous pine tree all across the south side of this old building. On the inside, you can see the further destruction. It was essentially gone. There was going to be no renovation, no matter the cost. So this becomes the sad end of this old barn. And of course, some people will have memories preserved of it more so than other people. This is a published picture of one of the shareholders trying to point to where the old barn had been. So rest of it was old lease cabins that had been abandoned. For a time, they were made available as potential lease sites to some of the minority shareholders. Those leases offered by my father and the corporation were not availed, and so they needed to be cleared from the land, which I did in 2014. This is what the sites look like after that. Those derelict properties are taken away. Another example of one, the lake beyond it, barely be seen in this trashy little old place. It used to be a site where some of the shareholders would come up and vacation in the summer. It looks like with that gone, boathouse, trash filled, gone. Other site, there was once a bunkhouse for a sawmill cruise on the beach. That's gone. One thing that we were able to do is renovate my parents' home. That became a place where some of the caretakers would stay, and also some of the shareholders would come up and vacation during summer months. And I was able to have my mom come out and visit her old home, and she will send us to be able to uh, realize the views that she's seeing and saw for decades and decades. Not only was she able to see the inside of her renovated home, we were able to take her for one last visit over to the old log home where she was born and grew up. And I know that she recognized the experience. And the issue of what to do with these old cabins that are cluttering the corporate property. They've been there since the 1950s, and they now too are very decrepit, although they're still leased properties. So, in July of 2014, the urging of Steve Klatt and the late wife Barbara, had all of the leaseholders come up for a meeting. Dave Hansen, a board member, was also there for that meeting. We informed the leasers at that time that we were going to be getting out of the leasing business, much like Idaho Department of Lands. And finally, in February of 2020, sent out another letter officially notifying them that Green Enterprises were getting out of the business of leasing out properties. Certainly had more than adequate notice for this vacation of the properties they've been. So then begins the task of trying to clean up all these old cabins, going to require their destruction and dealing with the remnants of them. And this by doing controlled burning, which could only be done at absolutely appropriate times because of wind and drying conditions. Also, the nearness of one site to another site, thought of getting a fire going in one of them that would end up causing all of them to go down was very much on my mind. Also, we had to prove that there was no asbestos in these places. So it was going to be a time-consuming, very expensive proposition for the corporation to deal with. So that meant that the next thing after beginning and nearly concluding the cleaning up of the property, which would be for some time, we could turn the attention of the corporation to managing the forest. Some people have said that they thought that my parents did not want the land cleaned up. In fact, they wanted it to just be able to return to a state of nature completely unmanaged. I would like to show them this picture from my mother's photo collection, where she's essentially boasting about the fact that she and my father have been able to clean up a tiny portion of this land. And she takes a picture of how it was before and after 1987, and she refers to it to my dad's woodlots. doing that proudly. This is what they really would like to see done. Fact is, it was absolutely beyond their capacity to do this, but the methods that they would apply. So the other thing that I did was I returned to a forest management plan that they'd actually been given in 2008. And the forester, Lee Andrews, and I believe Mike Walcott had really painstakingly prepared one plan, and it's a matter of just really getting it updated. So in 2013, this picture was actually presented to all of the shareholders and officers and council in 2014 at our annual meeting. So therein, Lee had identified the management objectives for the forests. That would be that there would be a species shift in the forest away from the disease-prone, shade-tolerant species towards early sorrel or disease-resistant species such as western white pine, western larch, and the ponderosa pine. Then intention was to maintain sustainability, that the forest is a huge asset of the corporation, and it needs to be managed for continuing yield. And if we going to a younger age classes of naturally occurring regeneration, and also doing huge amounts of tree plant. This is going to reduce the hazard of wildfire, removing the dead trees and increasing the space between the trees, reduce the amount of hazardous forest fuels with massification. Intention then will be eliminate the presence of noxious weeds along forest roads, trails, meadows. With this, it all should maintain and encourage wildlife use by the retention of critical snags, riparian coverage, and grass seedlings of landings roadside. Should consider the aesthetics of this very valuable land that's surrounding the lakefront with incredible views across the lake and onto the Cabinet Mount. But the aesthetics and recreational opportunities of the site were major issues. Finally, to manage this forest as an economic asset. Financially prudent manner, generate the most favorable income, property and estate tax situation for future generations consistent with conservation values. Very much putting the emphasis on this property as an asset. So Lee had isolated the forest health issues as being a difficult one. There's root rot out in that forest, and the fungus is going to kill the trees by destroying their root structure, particularly in the Doug fir and grand fir, which is known up here as white fir. And try and maintain the species like the red cedar and hemlock, which are affected, but are also very valuable there. Gradually, the forest will shift to western larch, ponderosa pine, and white pine. This was anticipation of climate change. Very much recognized that the climate continuing to warm, global warming, not climate change, global warming, is going to cause a shift in these species. And if we don't anticipate it for the 40 or 50 years in the future, the forest will be in dire shape. So this is what the forest looks like at the time. You can go out and wander any part of it. This is what you will see. All of this debris left around from old logging practices. This goes on and on and on. It all needs to be cleaned up. And the expense of doing this will be enormous. So he had identified what he called resource units. Each one of these resource units was going to require a different management strategy. That's the detail that they were bringing to this. One of the things that had really been identified was that the roads didn't have any communication with one another. So the idea was that the loggers were going to make approximately 2,100 feet of road deconstruction required to be done by them. Will include the cost per MBF, the delivered bid load from the bills, I guess, are from them. The landowner will bear the cost of culverts, crushed rock, or gravel and road fabric. Logger will be responsible for smoothing the base rock or gravel. So this is very much a shared cost of improving the property, influent portion of which is going to be done by the loggers doing logging. So one of the issues was how to improve the road. At that time, it was identified that there was this enormous gravel berm, probably an ancient deposit, and it just was there. The only thing I'd ever heard of any value about it was my grandfather thought that the cattle grazing up there, chewing their cud on it, benefited from the late breeze coming off to move the flies away from them. Cows were gone, but remaining was what was calculated to be almost 300 dump truck loads of gravel available for the corporation as their corporate asset. So, does rocking roads pay? It turns out there's a great deal written in the forestry literature about the importance of managing these roads and realizing that if they're not maintained locally, they're going to have long-lasting effects and erosion, sedimentation, etc. Or even articles talking about do rocking roads pay, with an economic analysis of the benefit of getting the roads in your forest rocked. And again, numerous articles out here, papers on the benefit doing this procedure. So this was incorporated as a goal of improving the property. We were able to get Aaron Vieira and local hauler to do this. It was absolutely amazing to see how they could manage to lay down this rock in those roads. And it really came to be a huge benefit when we started doing the logging in 2013, 2014, starting to move large loads out over the roads now. So with it also came entirely new ways of logging crocodile. My father, unfortunately, had really resisted the utilization of these new mechanized logging practices because he thought that this equipment would be too hard on the land. As it turns out, that 70-ton Scheller buncher has less of an impact on the land than individual loggers going out there with chainsaws and trying to skid these logged trees across the lane. Tend to leave a lot of limbs lying about, tops, butt ends, and such. And that's what we saw in some of these other photographs of what the forest fire looks or floor looks like. So here we see the way that the Scheller buncher puts it in what they refer to as a stick. Will be a number of the trees brought together, and the trees are pulled completely out of the woods by a large skidder that deposits the trees whole in a processing area. Skidder leaves the trees are picked up by a processor, which can delimb these right to the side, leaving no stubs that would be docked as far as grading at the mill. It's just amazing precision that this huge machinery brings to the entire task. I'd like to call your attention to the lake that can now be seen in the background, which from this site you could not even see before this all began. Processor cuts them to length to a centimeter. Takes so much of the tree and uses it, otherwise would probably not be left. It's not economical. That's used, and the top goes on to what will become an enormous burned pile instead of scattered around and left on the forest floor. From the processor, a loader is able to pick them up and even sort them by log type for which mill needs what. Just a wonderful process to watch, and it brought much added value to the property and furnished a nice logging residue for that time. Here, but what about this issue about cleaning the forest debris for fire prevention? And this is another area where there's tremendous amounts of forestry information available, mastication, which sort of equipment to use, and the benefit of doing it and how it reducing these fuels, these fuels through mastication and the ecological benefits of it. So with that, these became my new buddies. And I know I've been greatly criticized for the amount of money that I spent on the getting equipment to be able to enable me to do the final cleaning up of that property. And what it is going to do is this ground that was not really approachable from the logger's point of view, it's worth it, and it wasn't their met, to begin with. I was able to use the mulching head and the smaller excavator to clear out this ground. This is what it would look like after tending to what an area that I think my mother and father would find very enviable, because it magnified Dad's woodlot on a scale that is unimaginable to them. Able to stack the remnant logs, get tons and tons of this forest debris into controlled sites, burned, and it was safe to do so. So it doesn't matter. Does it really matter? In August of 2020, I received a call when I was in town, Dale, and hear that there seems to be a lot of smoke coming up from back in the forest. What had happened is there had been a lightning strike, perhaps even a day or two before, but it finally smoldered a bit and took off. With that, the crew from Selkirk and IDL were called out. They were able to drive right to the sites. And the crew chief told me that this was really quite an incredible event because of the fact of their access to that forest that they had. And I can only imagine if it had come down into forest fuels that were like this. I talked to Lee Andrews, the forester, about it. I said, Lee, you can't imagine the grief. No, he knows the grief, actually, that I got over trying to clean up this forest, for which I billed no operator time whatsoever to the corporation. Granted, it was a bit of a hobby for me cleaning it up, and it was a way to deal with the grief that I had during that time with the loss of my late wife, Barbara. But I said, in response to all that, no, it's not worth very much when it's all turned to ash. That's what it would have probably been if lightning had started in a place like that. Then begins the process of doing the shifting by seedlings. We were able to plant for 35,000 2015 to begin the process. I'm happy to report this new forest is coming along magnificently. So then we look to the other objective, and that is we're going to have to prepare this property for sale or partner. And the reason is this is beyond the scope of the family corporation to manage. I used to say to them at these meetings, you lack what I called the 3 C's. You lack the competence, lack the capital, but mostly we lack the culture. There was no shared vision about what to do about the corporation and management of it. So I thought this was going to be rather easy. I thought that we were going to be able to just get through the legal climate, which I knew existed. I guess this was to make kind of an illustration of my naivety at that time. And we were going to be able to establish a conservation easement, find a business partner back in these states, is continue with the forest management and continue selling and building and marketing. It returns again to the philosophy I stated in 2007. So I thought we were really in a very great position because I had found an architectural firm that could emphasize the very values that we wanted to see carried forward. And this was a proposal that is from Architects West by John Mueller. And I tried to call out to the corporation early on when there was objection about the development, but reminded them that the original developers of Camp Bay were actually my grandfather, my great-grandmother, Anna Van Schravendijk, and then my grandmother, Kate Van Voorhees, at that time. Totally quite a Dutch accent here, as you'll notice. So in 2007, when I'd written to Kathy and Gary, I proposed that what we would be able to do is get a conservation easement on this portion of the property. We would be able to get a scenic easement that would protect the whole periphery, essentially, of the bay. And this amount would be available for the family, which meant that we could sell or do it amongst ourselves if we decided, or just be a small marina area. This is 2007. So in 2010, I come forward at an annual meeting and say, this is maybe what we can. The idea is that we'd have no development in this forest easement, satisfy my mother's and father's interest in preserving the forest, and that we would get the road shifted over here, and we'd have this to develop. So with those as guidelines, this crew or team composed of landscape architects, and John Mueller, who was the chief of the project, was a noted landscape architect in Coeur d'Alene. He had described this to his professor from Utah. Was so enthused about the possibility, he comes in and participates pro bono, or at least no expense to the corporation. And then we have religious groups involved in engineering. So I thought we came up with a pretty good plan. The idea is this is going to be a development designed around the fact that we would be planning and branding should emanate from the historical wellspring of Van Schravendijk homestead founders. Best practices will be employed as a foundation for the work. Solutions must originate and evolve from the prospective market, but must also be responsive to what the land tells us. Land. Calibrated and responsive to the market, and respectful of the regional context. Hope is not a strategy. The project has to be. Broader view is this is a legacy project. We're going to really emphasize the historical aspect of this property and the intention of being able to invite new custodians into the land who will cherish and help respect it as my grandparents did and my parents did and I do. We had even, I thought a name at Dutch Woods would be a very appropriate for it. And here's my grandfather on the cover of the presentation, standing in front of one of the enormous ponderosa pines, or in this area, they refer to them as yellow pine. So here was the project, the plan that they came forward with. There would be no development immediately around the lake. There wouldn't be a marina, but this would be the area of development back in here, and it also had involved some conservation. And we were so fortunate to have a local authority on landscape design, one that was so well known because he'd actually written a book on the Coeur d'Alene Park. So John comes forward to our annual meeting in 2017. I think I can pretty much refer to this as Inquisition, because this poor guy was really almost more of an academician than any kind of real estate salesperson. Thought he was presenting to people that really would be interested in this sort of a project. Pretty much he came away having confronted a very aggressive audience and realizing we were trying to develop a project that would be appealing to investors, became very obvious there was not going to be consensus enough in this corporation to be able to go forward with a plan like this. So it was really abandoned. So the next thing I thought that could be obtained, that there seemed to be very much of a consensus, is to establish a conservation easement on a part of the property. I really didn't know what conservation easements were all about. I am very confused with the idea of nature conservancy. So I thought that accumulating a number of documents to help understand it would be very useful to all of us. I distributed this. It was, I believe, almost 500 pages of studies on conservation. And it really identified that the problem with these easements is that there's no policing, essentially. So the issue becomes when you have a county road that's bisecting the property and you have a waterfront faces public water, how do you keep it from being essentially invaded if no one's going to police it? So that part looked to be really difficult. So much for that. So the question then, when there was so much agreement that mom and dad wanted a conservation easement, why didn't it happen? Who prevented it from? Well, here was an early attempt, and that was a letter from Eric Grace, who at the time was the Clark Fork Pend Oreille Conservation, to my father, saying, and everyone, saying that they're going to need a letter of intent signed by everyone. I will need a signed copy, signature sheets from the officers, Ralph, James, and Randy. Please wait until you receive hard copies. SPS. So, and then that he was going to distribute it to the shareholders, and everything seems to be going along fine. Here's my reply back in September 15th that I'm in a general agreement with this proposition, but I do think there should be some fine-tuning. I like to see the west to south line placed along a topographical line roughly as stretched in '08. Just a dream, but maybe we could actually get the road shifted away from the lakefront. And I would like to see the language regarding management of the forest a bit looser. And I sketched out what I thought it might be. This is going to be 288 acres of conservation on the property. I signed mine, my father signs his, Randy is left a space, sign. Never signed. Then about a month after having sent out the signed copies and such, my father gets a letter from Eric Grace saying that they were looking forward to this project, but unfortunately, he received some replies from certain shareholders that are intensely opposed to the idea. So in 1 month, it all disappears. CFPOC is no longer interested in participating with Green Enterprises on doing a conservation easement. It should have been very much a possibility. So it took a couple of years till we really found out what the answer to this problem is. And that is, I'll pull this up on another screen so I can see it a little bit better close by. This was from the deposition that some of the shareholders who were suing me, Ralph, individual trustee of the Ralph Green Trust. They're suing of our mom, president. They're suing everybody they can. So they have the attorneys come up from Boise and depose Eric Grace about what happened. Why was there no conservation easement on the property? What they end up, this is a sworn deposition that, to get here, that here is their attorney Schwartz uh, interviewing Eric Grace, and unfortunately, I do not have a detailed record of all the phone conversations I had. I do recall having several telephone conversations. Kathy particularly comes to mind. She called me at least once, perhaps twice, goes on down. Their attorney, Jen Schwartz, asked Grace, what your recollections of your phone conversation with Kathy? He answers, with Kathy. Then he continues on. Randy, I believe, was also along the same lines. Question to him, do you have any specific recollections of what Kathy's objection to the easement was? And he continues on saying, he's the loss of development rights, which have a significant value. So the conservation strips away the development rights in the property. So you can't sell it for the largest and best use, which would be, subdividing and putting a bunch of houses on it. With the conservation easement in place, that is prohibited, thereby reducing the value of the property. So the talks with CFPOC collapsed. Now we have sworn testimony about how they happened to collapse. So much for some of the stockholders saying how much mom and dad wanted a conservation easement. So then we move on to another group that we talked were not poisoned. This was the Inland Northwest Trust, and we're discussing them at a board meeting on November 30th of 2011. Randy at that time was a director. My dad becomes quite emotional, as was the case often. He, in reply to Randy, says, my opinion is that's what your mother wants. That's why that's what your grandmother would have wanted, and all that. I just can't understand why you're opposed to it. And I mean, I can't understand, by golly. My mom wants that, kind of cynically as, I'm all for it, but no, who the hell is my mom? He's seeing that the motion was on the table and an opportunity, quickly moves to saying that there's no further constructive discussion. There's a motion, a second, and it passes. Jim and Ralph vote aye, Randy, nay. So here are those signed resolutions by my father and myself, trying to forward this along as a project. We even have members from Inland Northwest Trust out on site. And I'm happy to see that Dave Anson, a director, was there. Krista Forrest, who's manager of Inland Northwest Trust, and Lee Andrews, our forester. And we consider where this conservation needs to take place. And I had asked for one little extension of it. I'd like people to realize this was after both my mother and father had died. I am doing this because of the memory of them and their regard for the property, and thinking we could still really make this benefit to corporation. I asked for one little extension of it, a finger that would go out here to incorporate these wonderful cedar groves and some of the lakefront. So that seemed to be going along, and then suddenly we get another letter from the people at Inland Northwest. This is Krista Forrest, December 20th, writing that, Jim, I apologize. I kicked over the anthill with a simple question last week to Kathy. as to whether she and the other siblings want to do a conservation easement. Yes quickly turned to under the following condition. So they're holding the conservation easement hostage to their many demands of you and the corporation. When you and I spoke this fall, I outlined that INLC could move ahead with an easement if all the shareholders signed off. Failing that, we'd have to have $50,000 in escrow for legal defense. Since and before then, I received threatening emails from your siblings. My executive director and I have discussed the situation, and their threats make it unwise for INLC to accept a conservation easement from Green Enterprises absent unanimous shareholder approval. I'm sorry to add to your burdens. So I quickly try and send off a letter to Kathy, Gary, the entire corporation. Gary, you, Randy, and Kathy can determine whether or not there will be a conservation easement on the legacy land owned by Green Enterprises. I conclude by, if you truly want a conservation easement, then I think it can be accomplished. However, there needs to be an absolute focus on creating this agreement. If this process degenerates into negativity and unproductive digression, then I believe there will be no point in continuing a futile effort. Yes or no? You want to do this? I think it's rather unambiguous. So it didn't take long for this to arrive on the desk. It's from the leader of Inland Northwest, above Chris DeForest, essentially saying that they've had, it's evident from the email discussion that you all are having that there is no clear unified consensus around the subject of placing a conservation easement on your land at this time. Because of this, we have decided to remove ourselves from the conversation and will no longer engage in discussion about the conservation of your land. So, that concludes that. It's time to sell it all. That's where we're at in that. So, I was very fortunate in finding an excellent sales and realtor knowledgeable about the land. He had previously been the agent representing buyer, the largest land sale on the lake prior to his arriving to look at this opportunity out. So then the becomes maintaining the property rights that have been established by our ancestors and intended by parents, because those boundaries are the key to the value of the largest asset this corporation has. And I was constantly having to deal with trespassers as my father before and grandfather before him. As you can see, they could care less about private property. This is a group that I find out is named Lot Bala. And I just want to restate that the land that our grandfather and great grandmother obtained were titles directly from the United States of America. They earned title to their land, which they passed on to us and a corporate asset. It was signed by President Taft. So we have an obligation to defend what they achieved. And along comes, I've been asked, well, why would we ever be involved in this lawsuit with the Lot Ballas? Well, the plain and simple truth is we were sued by the Lot Ballas, along with everybody on the south side of the bay. They're contending that they have a right to get to this land because of these obscure mining claims at the end of the property. And they're saying that the plaintiffs, them, as successors and assigns of Sulphide South, are entitled to the benefit of the historical right of access across South Camp Bay Road and the express easement for ingress and egress across Sulphide North and resulting from the Sulphide segregation. I was absolutely certain this was bogus. This could not happen. One of the reasons was they're trying to say that this unique terrain is only reasonable land access to the sulfide mine, and they have to come across South Camp Bay Road to get to this property out here. I thought that was interesting because of the fact that all the activity, mining-wise, at that time occurred over in Garfield, which was in Midas, where the foundries and such were, all the mining supplies. And they had been able to have two mines, the Pollard mine, which is on our property, and the Portland mines at those sites, but absolutely no indication that they had to come across Camp Bay Road to be able to get there. There really wasn't even a road at that time. And nevertheless, that's their contention. So I was utterly convinced that there were roads out there that would prove that the other mines had been accessed from Midas, and that it was just a matter of showing those same roads coming to their sulfide mine. So I thought of new technology. This is a LiDAR drone from one of the local surveyors, Glahe. The idea is we're going to go out there and we're going to do what they did to find structures in the Honduran jungles hundreds of years ago. Unfortunately, the drone crashed, so that we didn't do that. But I was really convinced that the liens that we had, or right-of-ways, were so strong that there's no way that they could ever get access that violated these right-of-way agreements that we had. And my grandfathers had negotiated because they had such incredible observation of the fact that protecting against trespass was so vital. That's why their fence line were always maintained. That's why my father maintained. They knew that trespass could be a possibility of losing control of your own land. One of the ways that they had managed to show the power of those right-of-ways is that there was another adjacent property, which was the Allen property. And the Allen property is shown by this log house, only about 100 yards from our old log house. Both people were prevented from doing anything other than a boat access, or maybe from the back lands here, but they could never ever walk over my grandparents' land to get property. Consequently, the Allens in 1949 finally give up. And they say, I have always been thinking things over. I've been thinking things over regarding the sale of the property at Camp Bay. I've always said that my price was $100 per acre on part-time payments of $5,000 cash. However, I'll split the difference and let it go for $4,500 cash, which they'd done. That right-of-way was so strong that they had to give up their property because there was no passage over. So that's what I expected the judge would find. I was astonished, as were my neighbors on the south side of the bay, that the judge finds in their favor. Now, I'm respectful of the judicial process, but unfortunately for me, this actually makes true cynical philosophy of Trump's advisor, Roy Cohen, whose motto was, "Don't tell me what the law is. Tell me who the judge is." And I saw evidence of that very thing, to my mind, with this opinion. John Magnuson was so offended by this that he was willing to take this on essentially pro bono, to argue it up to the Idaho Supreme Court. And there were a few of us that would agree and help John with the incidentals with this payment. Privately, we're funding this. They were the Cummings, Larry and Kathy, and the Franks, Jim and Julie. and myself. John actually managed to obtain a very important concession. That was the Idaho Supreme Court finally finds that the district court had improperly expanded the easement accesses, so that they were now restricted from ever being able to use heavy equipment to go over our land to be able to do any of this development on the point out there. They were able to access it by a road with a private car, but they couldn't use construction vehicles to make the enormous road that they had planned. And as proof of the fact that I was the one sponsoring this, this is from my private account to John as one of the payments. So why do I feel so strongly about this land and the value of it and maintaining it? That is because my value and love of the land was obtained from my time as a child, a young teenager, being with my grandparents and living with them. Several weeks each summer of I was 16 and summer when I was 17. And just like to call attention to the fact that they are aged at this point, but still see my grandmother's gladioli growing in the background, the neatness of the garden, the neatness of the property. That's what they engendered in me. I was able to walk with my grandfather where I would be dropped off by the mailman in Glengarry, and why Glengarry was so important. This route up through our land, not needing the South Camp Bay Road thing, but they put in the South Camp Bay Road so they, as settlers, would have access to a road where they could get supplies. And this was that very important place for the pioneers. This was the Glengarry General Store, and this was the Glengarry Post Office. This is my mother right here, being on the sled. She's being towed with her horse, Queenie. She used to ride to her school at the Meadow Lake School there. So I also remember being up there helping my grandparents with the haying. Thus, this is kind of informative in some ways to the discussion and who's involved. And that is, this is me. This is Gary Brandy, an authority on the land, and his age at the time is about 3 or 4, and my sister Kathy. This is a picture my grandmother took of me on the steel boat that my grandfather would row to Hope for supplies, although he much preferred to be able to take a wagon over to the Glengarry store. And this is just before going into the Navy in September. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was able to transform my grandmother's diary, the 400 pages of cursive writing, into a text. The photos I've been able to put in there with the help of the North Idaho College Graphics Art Department. Very moving to see that what she says at the bottom of her diary, and this is written in the front page of it, is to be kept for my grandchildren. I hope it doesn't bore them. If it does, hold for great grandchildren when they are mature. December 27th of 1950. Now this is available to all those new custodians and stewards of the land, and this is a document that I've been told by so many that are there now about how much it had helped them to regard the land and its heritage. I have to really thank my parents so much for the fact that they really never did what many would do, and that was parcel out empty parts of it and take trips to Arizona or wherever. They preserved an entirety what my grandparents had put together. They also put me in the position as being the majority shareholder and becoming the president, who would decide would do what with the property. I absolutely am totally in debt to their trust and I knew what they were up against as of how difficult it is to keep people from trespassing on this spectacular bit of beach rock. This is just an example of what could be routinely encountered down there. People coming onto the ground. One time there had a fire down at Bayview. Sure enough, at one point I had people at the very same time trying to light a little campfire over here. But this was a good example of the kind of thing that could be encountered. I think you'll notice that, first of all, it begins with me getting the finger. Nothing to hide, sir. Don't know what your problem is. Yeah. Must have paid millions for those suspenders. So you get mocked, you get confronted. I was really seriously concerned at some point my dad would get shot by these people as he was so aggressive about doing it. Over. There we go. So about this time, we start to get an appreciation of the forces that really are out there that could really become challenging beyond the capacity of corporations to deal with. And that is, some of the shareholders decided to go public with this family conflict. And to give you an idea of the total absence of journalism in this area, you have this article, the front page news at the time on the Spokesman Review, with the accountant at the Spokane airport calling me, asking me, have I seen today's Spokesman Review? No. Well, it turns out here it is on the headline: A Siblings Battle in Court Over Fate of Forested Piece of Heaven on Lake Pend Oreille. Give you an idea of the total absence of journalistic professionalism. Contributor of this and given photo credits is Kathy LaFour. One of our shareholders is bringing this to the public's attention. It caused me to realize the power of everything when the letters to the editor had things saying such things as, can anybody take Guido fishing? I knew who Guido was, and I knew what fishing was. Godfather was one of my favorite movies. So I write to this Miss Russell, the journalism's first obligation, its essence is a discipline of verification. That you didn't really make any attempt. You didn't contact myself, Mr. Magnuson, the attorney, my mother's attorney, Mr. Boyd, parents' property owner, Mr. Klatt. And at this time, I didn't realize that this is the seeds of the whirlwind being sown. And it continued then later with, a thing about heaven and hell in the Sandpoint paper, about inside the legal family saga surrounding Camp Bay. So who do these journalists go to get information on this subject? Well, they go to one of our shareholders, Andy, who's never ever up there, his wife, daughter Megan, and others. Do they contact myself living up there? Do they contact our attorney, Paul Doherty? They talk to our property manager. No, they just go with it. So what this does now is it opens the door for these type of. There was Fred Arn that I knew very well because he was the junior G-man of the area. He would have given the neighbors walkie-talkies to be able to report about things going on around the local area. And he was considered an absolute blowhard by the neighbors, a person of no respect and ridicule. But this gives him a great forum. And with that, he and the others start to foment this mob. This mob with the idea that there is actually supposed to be public access to this lakefront down here. which was never, ever in any of the documents. With this, you see a GoFundMe site. And with this, again, this GoFundMe site, you start to see who's involved in it. You see that here is Andy Green and Kathy LaFleur and their contributors to the invalidation of property boundaries and rights that have been acquired by our ancestors and are precious. Randy further writes that, get this, that Randy writes, I'm so upset that my brother, James Green, started this disaster with a massive logging he began in 2014. Within a few years, the forest that my grandfather, John Van Scravendike, and mother, Jean Van Scravendike Green, had lovingly nurtured was mowed down. The yearly runoff has never looked anything like this from my memory, or any family descriptions. Now the new owners, M3, have come in and are planning to build a small town at Camp Bay. To do this, they apparently need to cause massive runoff and pollution into the lake. Of course, these go on, and trying to provide logical conjoinders is utterly useless. One thing I might quickly add is, just for the edification of Randy and others, this is the way it did used to. Randy says he doesn't ever remember it looking like that. And there is the stream coming down here, drainage. There's a weir across the creek so that my grandfather can pound it late in the summer for for irrigation across this little hay meadow he has. Most importantly, Randy, I'd like to call your attention to the fact that this is plowed ground. What you remember as marsh couldn't have been plowed by our grandfather. As far as who started this all, I really thought that this was started in 2012 when the three of you, Gary, Randy, and Kathy LaFleur, tried to file a guardianship and get custody of our mother because of incompetence and past. If that wasn't enough, you followed it up by suing them, first notifying them, the leasers, that this was a letter from their attorney telling them that informing that if you put on a motion my client's considers involving the conduct of certain shareholders, directors, and or officers of the corporation, specifically including but not limited to Ralph Green and Jean Green, the concerns involved but not are limited to the competency and or legal capacity of Ralph Jean and or Jean Green to negotiate and enter into lease or renewals, and your leases may be legal authority for purpose of negotiate. Anyway, they're suing our parents. I thought that's what started it. So as far as the audience they're playing to, I think this is a really illustrative. The fact is that this is a really dramatic sky titled Sunset at Camp Bay. Sunset at Camp Bay. I thought that was really odd, because I've seen some spectacular skies at Camp Bay while I was living there, but I've always seen the sun to come up in the east, not set. Just as the moon comes up in the east. It shows that when it comes to facts, this was written by a Susan Drumheller, a local authority on the history of Camp Bay, because it doesn't really matter. So what does that end up provoking? I think it's called stochastic communication. So it's something that's really much influencing our current politics. I hear shots being fired one night while Gail and I were there. We'd heard guys turning around. Their massive pickups are roaring around. But these were shots. So the next day, I go down and on the ground, and of course, this is what I find. Guido has received the message. Message received. That's are the forces that are out there now. Fortunately, we didn't have to deal with them. Those, all things, Eric and Brett Stevens had managed to sell the property. Not only sold it, they sold it for $3.5 million more than it had been raised for by an assessor capable of valuing property without any comparables. It was extraordinary. The firm was extraordinary. We benefited extraordinarily. So much for maintaining the property rights by the ancestor descended by parents. Now M3's issue. Scope of what was before them is really evident as they begin to uh, pile up the gravel that they're going to need on their roadways. I did think that Randy would be very happy to see that they are also managing the runoff that's supposed to happen. I thought they were going to just let it run, but I guess not. So as far as the scope of the bay, there will only be 7 lots free of the bay. The openness of the bay has been preserved, and we have managed to get out. I have so many to thank. Again, I thank my parents before. I have to thank Travis Hull, the original attorney for the corporation. Also led us to Paul Doherty, our great attorney now. And he created foundational documents so repudiated the allegations of some of the shareholders that were of immense value. Of course, Steve, I can't say enough about his ability to direct and control these meetings and what needed to be done with resolutions and documenting different aspects of our passage along the way. Have him presented as the pilot of a vessel that I could hardly navigate with. Uh, him operating is wonderful. I thank so much on the record for Steve. Dave, of course. Dave wandered into a situation that I don't think he could probably quite believe. My dad was probably the most gleeful I've ever seen him. When Dave was contacted and asked by Kebis, he would actually be able to assume a directorship position. Dave replied back on the call, all heard. Yeah, actually, he could. He was over at the local Starbucks, and he'd be over just a few minutes. I thought my dad was going to choke. So, anyway, and of course, to my late wife, Barbara, who was such an accomplished woman, and she was also an officer for a time in the corporation, was someone that right out of the 5-year nursing program at the University of Washington, takes a nursing position at the Royal Saudi Hospital in Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia. He was the nursing ombudsman for Emmanuel Hospital in Portland for 5 years, and then had a important job with the Red Cross for many years. She essentially gave up her dream home. And my parents asked if we could come up and be there nearby with them because all of the conflict that they were having to deal with. We decided that we were near enough a time of retirement. We could do that. So we left our home in Portland, Oregon to come up to be near to my parents. I have to thank the legal representation I've had with Paul and John Magnuson, had professional accountants with Brent Stutzky and Suzanne, foresters with Lee Andrews and Mike Walcott, and plush realtors and Harry Skinner and Brent Stephen. I have to really call out for special attention my thanks to my stepson, Charles, Mike, and Brian. They have stood beside me through utterly vicious, ugly assault, and I'm so sorry that those persons decided not to participate in this conference call. I can't help but think it reminds me of some sort of a cowardness on their part. Um, here uh, are, I am sure, though, that those persons absolutely know that this is Count Hallie, Haley. It's so often mockingly stated, and I really appreciate my occasional support from my own children. And of course, Gail. 5 years after losing Barb, I'm reacquainted with a high school sweetheart with Gail, who had left and obtained postgraduate work in D.C. with the CIA for some years, and came back and became the CEO of the National Psoriasis Foundation. He absolutely knows the dynamics of corporations and such. Having her with me now is an absolute treasure. She's been very helpful these last several years of this transition. And of course, I have to give just a bit of a background of why it was I was, I think, able to endure all of this attack for so many years. And my life was not Green Enterprises. My life beforehand was a very, very different thing. And I began it on this aircraft carrier in some ways. That this is where I learned how to work in the operating room. That carried on to working in local hospitals after graduating college, and love of flying and have commercial pilot license that I'd obtained along the way. So now I'm able to blend my knowledge of working in the operating room and orthopedic trauma procedures, with my ability to service accounts with the newly emerging technology of opening up fractures and augmenting operatively instead of in traction or casting. And so with the aircraft, I was able to go from hospitals on the Oregon coast all the way to the Dakota border. So along the way, I really met some incredibly wonderful people. They're responsible for so much of what I could do and my attitude on way businesses should be conducted. This is Hanjorg Beast. He is my billionaire I'll probably know or knows me by name. I'm Gary, his right-hand guy, early here. And because of my involvement in sales, I was brought into product development, and Hanjorg had my back. And when you have the competence of the owner of the company, came in and we had a little over $2 million of sales 5 years before I got there. When Hanjorg left, he sold it to Johnson & Johnson for $20 billion. I think that gives some idea of his business acumen. He supported me. So there were projects that people thought couldn't be done. I didn't really think this could be done. But this would be an example of one of the products that I have patent to, just so I'm not blowing any wind here. This is the patent from the United States of America to me. What this does is the way to accumulate these bone reamings, and these bone reamings with a friend here, Kim Weber, Methodist. I knew him from Harborview as a resident, a fellow. And we were able to do cases like this, where the woman has this massive bone loss, this RIA material, which is accumulated, as here, puts it in here, she regrows the bone. With this took me to a meeting of Professor Moscalet, who was the head of trauma of Steve in Aubigny, a suburb of Paris, an absolute expert on limb salvage, keeping people from getting their limbs amputated because of the trauma, kind of horrific injuries he would be dealing with. I found this when I looked around to find out, is there any a prelude or a precursors to what Kim and I had stumbled across? And we found out that Professor Moscalet had an entire paper that had never been seen really in orthopedic literature in the United States. Here I am with Professor Moscalet. They had us together for a little group. Here on that particular document now, if you go to the National Library of Medicine, put in my invention, Reaper irrigator aspirator. It's talking about these millings from the bone. There are 20 pages, almost 470 attributions that acknowledging that patented device that I have. Another one that I have a patent on was a way to fix proximal humerus fracture. This is an MD PhD from Martin Hessman and out of Mainz. The idea this is the sort of thing that I'm used to dealing with, not the kind of things I had to deal with as with Green Enterprises and the kind of character I dealt with. There's a poor lady that's fallen in her garden. 88 years old, her bone doesn't heal. Terrible. So, talks to a surgeon at Emmanuel Hospital that I know very well, puts in that device that I come up with. This is her right after the surgery with a staple. And fortunately, here she is 4 months after. And if someone said, this is the most important picture, this is her with a smile. These are the people I used to be with. It invited me to a 2017 meeting of this is the Congress for Orthopedics and Surgery, or accident surgery, as they say. One of them, a particular friend, all of them are our friends, but this was Peter Giannudis that runs the service at Leeds. He had Gail and I to his home. We shared for him with 3 nights. Places it's taken me. Here I am in Yangon. We're about ready to get a flight out with Dr. Hatai, going up to Makitna. There's such a dangerous fracture up there that they want to send him up. He insists on taking me with us. And I said, I can definitely pay for this. He says, no, Myanmar government insists that you pay for your flight. So here he is with the dangerous piece without any x-ray control, how easily that could have perforated the femoral artery, killed the person probably. I was able finally then to take ALF to see some of the places I worked in Davos. Here is Jeff Richard, I've known for over 30 years, taking Gail on what he called the Royal Tour. Wasn't kidding. As we passed by, she points out the fact that there's a picture of him, Prince Charles, doing the tour of this institute where I used to go quite often. They so graciously took us to lunch, and it just is a harbin. It just precedes what my life was before encountering Green Enterprises. So when I stepped out, my first grade, my mom took this picture of me, shoes probably on the right foot and the left foot, going the wrong direction. I had no idea what it was like. Head down at 79, position to look back, and all I can say about it all, thank you, life. It's really been grand, and I appreciate all of the people that have helped me to get where I am right now. With that, I'll turn it back to Steve.